Adam, thanks so much for joining me here today. Really appreciate
Hi,
it.
hi,
You said
Sean.
you said you were going to give me some candid answers. I guess people listening to this will decide whether that's true or not. Uh, so you asked me to read your book. It was like 300 plus pages. I haven't read a 300 plus page book in quite some time. I live in Los Angeles. I listen to audiobooks. Uh, But being your friend, I decided to do it. And I was shocked how quickly that book went. Like 10 pages in, I couldn't stop turning the pages. And I'm not just saying this to be nice. It was real crazy turn of events. I mean, I learned so much about you and the life you led before I met you, which I had no idea. And then, I mean, it was just one thing after another in building that company. It's really crazy. Um, so I wanted to, I'm really happy to talk to you today and kind of ask you some questions and see, how things go here. So, I guess before we start, the first thing I want to talk to you about is your public perception. The media portrayed you as both a pioneer and a villain in the cannabis industry. People outside of MedMen really love to hate you. And I don't think, from my perception, I don't think your employees did. I think it was only people outside the company. And you did very, you did very little to dissuade them. I would even say you poured gasoline on the fire. Like, was that a conscious decision, your public perception, or how did that unfold?
Wow, Sean, that is a great first question. That is a loaded question. I think it was a conscious omission, right? It was a conscious omission in my daily, routine, to pay any attention or time to the individual, myself, the human, me, the actual father and husband, to that person's public persona as an individual. It wasn't something I wasn't aware was possible to, work on or invest time into. In fact, I paid attention as other CEOs and business leaders. This is in the time of, reality TV exploding, right? And on the business side, there were so many brands created for business people, through the explosion in content on the internet and all the reality stuff, that I saw people like Mark Cuban, who was just a business geek, become a business brand. So it wasn't something that was lost on me, that with the investment of time and energy, one could take the position I was in and figure out how to curate a public caricature around it. I consciously omitted that from my day to day, right? The caricature of me was the CEO of MedMen, the founder of MedMen, the guy on television screaming about marijuana being legal and, forcing it onto places like Fifth Avenue and, in Beverly Hills, right? And so that public caricature of the CEO and, let's call it, the face of mainstream marijuana,
Hmm.
um, that was the caricature that you're talking about. And I did nothing to refute it. In fact, right or wrong, I looked at it like it was one of the inevitabilities of this journey at a certain point, that, being in that role, would lead to that type of caricature, almost irregardless of who was in the role itself. And it really came, that was something I really thought about when, South Park, uh, opened up one of its seasons and had a couple of shows around marijuana and specifically MedMen. Um, and it just dawned on me, whoever the first, or at this point in time, corporate face of weed was for sure gonna be villainized. It just makes more sense. The actual person that I am, Of course, there's always kernels of truth in any kind of caricature, but for the most part, couldn't have been further from who I was, as a human. But no, that was who I was marching on my mission, and it wasn't lost on me that there was all of this hate, um, being thrown at that character.
Yeah. I mean, when we first met, you were very brash. I thought it was kind of amusing and interesting. We had spoken about you, you had once said like inferred you don't have time for small talk or pleasantries. You're like in a hurry, you got to get to the point. You know, I dissented on that opinion, saying, social lubrication goes a long way. And whatever, you were the one who was winning in a big way. So I had to defer to you on that. But it was really interesting. And I saw how you treated your people with empathy and grace. And when someone left the company, I'd say you were more than generous with them. And then, now I know you. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, to people should know is like in the beginning, and for a big part of it, you were not a cannabis user. Now you are an active cannabis user, and you're a much more charming person. I don't know how that, I don't
Well, of
know.
course that's true. I mean, cannabis makes the world a, safer, healthier, happier place. And there's nothing I believe in, more than that. And yeah, I mean, as I, talk about in the book, my journey into cannabis as a business had nothing to do with me as a consumer, right? It had everything to do with a business opportunity that presented itself that I jumped at and then went through this crazy intense journey over 10 or 15 years, and it's documented in the book, as a result of. But me and my own personal journey with cannabis, yeah, for sure. When I was about 36 years old, I started smoking weed again. And I think I haven't missed many days since. So if I'm more charming as a result, thank you, Sean. It makes me a better father, and it makes me a better husband, and I think it makes me just a better human.
Yeah.
Being able to take that step back and really recognize what's real in any given moment.
So cannabis is making you more present, is what I'm gathering here.
Amen, among a million other things.
So let's go back to the beginning of the story. And like this, not knowing you before this, I was blown away. Like, let's like take us in. So the beginning of the story is when you have this sort of fledgling ad business. You walk into a dispensary on Sunset Boulevard and you have, this epiphany. Tell us about like that experience, what was going on there, what was running through your mind.
Well, the scene in the book you're referencing, I think that chapter is the blue-haired lady uh,
Yeah.
scene or chapter.
Also,
I
like tell us a little bit about like your life situation at that moment. And then
I was in my mid 20s. I was, financially, going from thing to thing as an entrepreneur, someone who had my own income since, I was a teenager. And I was in a bad rut or run. And trying to work my way out of that. Andrew Maudlin and I, out of the places we were living, started helping people with branding and marketing. That was a service we were selling. And that business had minimal traction, couldn't pay the bills. Um, and Laura and I, my wife now, girlfriend at the time, we actually moved in and were living with my parents in their apartment after I had been kicked out of my apartment, evicted. So, cannabis kind of shows up by way of this attempt that was underway to build this branding and marketing company there in Los Angeles. And someone from the marijuana world reaches out to that business and says they
Mhm.
want branding and marketing help. I don't consume marijuana at the time. I have no issue with marijuana at the time. I'm seeking opportunity at the time, and I can't pay my bills. And so there's this moment in my life big scene in the book, right, where I'm walking into the first pot shop I had ever walked into. And it was this blue-haired, crazy lady.
And this is
You
in
know,
2009, which is, I think, important, right?
it was in
2009.
2009. Yeah, it was in Hollywood. Um, and this dingy business storefront, almost repulsive storefront, um, a storefront that almost felt like it didn't want to be seen, was generating so much business. There were so many people that, despite all the warning signs and all the trepidation it gave me walking in that door the first time in 2009, people were working through that, getting through that to come out the other side with that product. And that's what blew my mind was that, yeah, go ahead.
So at this time, this is medical marijuana. You have to have a card to buy cannabis, right?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to see.
No, yeah, that's what it was. And so, despite all of these hurdles, you had to have a recommendation from a doctor in California at the time. Um, you had to be willing to drive to Sunset Boulevard to this storefront. You had to be willing to be seen, perhaps, by other people trying to find the front of a nondescript storefront and then going into said storefront. You would do it acknowledging that there's something fishy legally about it because you would have known that, yeah, it might be kind of legal here, but it's not really legal in the country. And that's why it feels shady walking in. And then
Mhm.
upon walking in, that generation of store, that blue-haired lady's store, I mean, it was filthy. I mean, it wasn't run like a optimized retail environment. It was run like a back alley, weed shop. And it looked that way. But despite all of that, people were working through and overcoming and even closing their eyes to some of those hurdles in order to bring that product home with them. Right. And that's what blew my mind. That amount of demand, despite, all those barriers. And then those people that were set up to supply that demand, in that point, I didn't understand anything. But it seemed to me like they were just ignoring that opportunity.
So what is the next step you take to actually launch yourself into the business?
Um, well, it takes me about a year back then. And, I count for some of it in the book. There's a scene where I'm at a lawyer's office, Stu Richland, this
Hmm.
weed lawyer in back in Hollywood. Um, but on the other side of that meeting with Stu Richland, everything good, bad, and hilarious that came out of that meeting, I find my first lease, and that was 756 Washington Boulevard on the corner of Abbot Kinney and Washington in Venice, California. Um, and I secure that lease, and I, at that point, make the commitment that I'm getting into the weed business. I knew not much more than what a couple of weed attorneys had told me, what I experienced with the blue hair lady. But I had a lease in hand and I needed something to work out personally. And I took the leap to make a commitment to make this that thing that needed to work out,
And what was the name of your first dispensary?
the treehouse.
Interesting. Okay. So let's move forward where I can't actually, obviously we don't have time for the whole book. But there's the next crazy scene in the book for me, which really changed my, didn't really change my opinion of you, but added to the thickness of it was your this this showdown at the I think it's referred to as showdown at the Panda Express. There's like an intense scene in the book where someone believes you owe them money and they're sort of going gangster on you and you have your own bodyguard. Explain like that situation, how you came into that situation where you have this showdown at a Panda Express and what transpires during and yeah, what happened there? Like really
I
interesting.
mean, what's happening at that point in my life is we open the treehouse and marijuana, cannabis, medical marijuana, anything to do with that in a business was a black box unless you were in that world. And so in opening the treehouse, it was also me walking through a door, entering a whole new world. And the deeper I got into that world, as committed as I was to making this the business opportunity that would work out for me and Laura, the deeper I got into all aspects of that world. And fundamentally, that world was criminal.
Yeah.
And this is something that is just binary. Um, and it's not a judgment on whether it should have been or should be. It is just a fact, right? That underlying all of this was a federally illegal activity.
Yeah.
Um, and so, as a result of, as it works, as a result of not having the protection of the law, businesses that live outside of that protection, they adjudicate themselves, right? They have their own rules and enforcement in order to have, anything work. And so, getting into this, my full intention was to get into this business inside of a legal opportunity, which was the treehouse, the medical marijuana business, as legal as we could operate that. But it still was a criminal enterprise, by
Yeah.
definition in federal law, right? And so living in that world and operating in that world, um, I dealt with landlords and banks, and we dealt with suppliers and brokers and enforcers. And that was the supply chain, at that time was still completely outside of any kind of, regulation. It was just kind of the storefronts and to some small extent, these cultivation facilities that had, some legality to them. And so there was a scene that we that's in the book. And it's a moment where, and it's not like this is so anomalous, like it never happened only this one time. Because once you're in that world, you're in that world. But there was a scene in the book where Laura and I actually go away for our honeymoon. And while we're on our honeymoon, there is a fake robbery of some product that was some cannabis that was coming down to be stored in LA and then distributed, through us in our stores. And while I was gone, I got, this set up phone call to let me know that basically while it was down uh, back in LA, there was a robbery. And so I would be on the hook to pay the full amount of what was stolen. I was in Mexico. So
Hmm.
coming back, it was something that living in that world, it just that was the supply chain, and it was just a situation that is the way in which it was dealt, it was dealt with was there was a meeting set up and somebody came down trying to strong arm me into paying them
So let
money.
me
Yeah.
just back up. So you ordered some product for someone, but
Yeah.
it never touched your hands. You never
No.
received it, but
Yeah.
the grower said you still owed them the money.
Yeah. After some elaborate fake robbery scheme while I was out of the country.
Okay.
Yes.
And then now their enforcer is going to meet you.
Now we're going to have a meeting, and I pick a Panda Express inside of a food court down the street from the apartment I was living in Marina Del Rey in the middle of the day, um, feeling like that would be a safe option. And we sit down and meet this person, and after telling them that, I'm happy to meet them, but there's no money that I can pay them for product I never received. They at, they decided to aggressively begin to try to attack me. And, sitting across from them was somebody that had come with me that was part of my security. And that person jumped across the table and knocked this person into the glass of the Panda Express in the middle of the day during the lunch rush. Um, I
Hmm.
mean, what a crazy moment to have lived through looking back now as a 43-year-old man. Um, But yeah, this person flew up into the glass and was knocked unconscious. And when came to, this little old woman from inside the Panda Express ran out and gave him a napkin to clean up the blood on his mouth. Um,
And do you
and
think it was
yeah,
do you think it was a good idea to hire a Crips gang member as your bodyguard?
I, I don't think it's about a good idea, a bad idea. I think it's about, you know, me being as honest as I can be in taking the 3 years I took to write this book, Sean, in
Yeah.
explaining where I was in that moment,
Yeah. That's
and
fine. I'm
doing
just
my best to,
yeah.
give the reader enough context so they can make their own decision as to what's a good and bad idea. I can tell you what I think looking back, what I wish I would have told my younger self at all these different moments. But at that point in time, I was committed to making, medical marijuana my business. And that was the medical marijuana supply chain in the state of California.
Hmm.
And being who I was at that time as a man and as a human, um, I had nothing to lose, and I didn't wake up, scared of anything except not prevailing. And so, through that commitment, I find myself in that craziest of scenarios as just a result of me continuing to say, well, that's the business I'm in. That's the deal I have to
Yeah.
make. Those are the people I have to make this deal with. Um, and
Speaking of
that
that,
actually follows me through the whole book, right?
yeah, it does follow you through the whole book. But I wanted to make a note. Something that struck me in reading the book was the guy who came down to meet you. You said to him and his boss, "Look, I'll answer your phone calls. I'll talk to you. I'm not taking your calls. I'll meet with you, but I'm not going to pay you for something I didn't receive." So you were really kind of transparent. You weren't hiding from them. Uh, and you had this moment where you punched the guy, their liaison in the face. Now, what happened? Like, what are you thinking? Like, these guys are going to come back, like you go with, you shoot them, they shoot two of yours. Like, what's running through your mind and what actually happened?
No, I mean, I think that I end that scene or chapter in the book, where I get home at night and I'm looking over and Laura's peacefully asleep and I don't know how to go to sleep because that's my world. That's what I'm living in. She's getting her PsyD in clinical psychology, going to school and being just the best human ever. And this is what I'm caught up in, Um, so, it wasn't, again, it's not like I didn't acknowledge that there were consequences for all of this. It's that when I got into this business and even during these times that you're talking about, I still, in my mind, that character was the guy with nothing to lose. And so that guy was willing to go as far as he needed to go in his mind to be successful at, the venture at hand. Um, and so there was a part of all of that to me. I think, poker's a big part of the book. Poker's a big part of my story. And this concept of detachment is something that poker has been tremendous in teaching me in my life, right?
Hmm.
The ability to detach from a chip or from an outcome of a single hand, understanding that it's about, the million hands and making right decisions, regardless of outcomes that aren't always, correct with the odds. And that level of detachment is something that maybe was, inside of me at this moment. But yeah, I mean, I account for it in the book. There was a meeting, if you will, that took place where a case was made as to what took place and how I represented myself and what went down. And the boss of this group of people ultimately laughed them out of the room and told them not to come back with their story, that there was nothing I did that was out of line based on what went down. So, um,
So they were
and actually
ultimately he respected you for what you did. And
he did, and it's in the book, but talking about like this crazy journey and all the different worlds that I passed through, all the rooms I'm in, I actually I got that phone call um basically to like tell me that that was the final outcome while I was working on some corporate weed stuff, prepping for an interview or talking to a potential client where I was representing as I always wanted it to be, this completely legitimate operation. And so that pulling at me from this world and that world, I remember getting that call from Jackie, who's in the book too, letting me know that it was all good at the end. Um, but also knowing that that was a moment where I was, making this final decision to go all in on what I call corporate weed,
Right.
and get completely out of that criminal world.
So you sell the treehouse and you go down to Orange County and you open up another, maybe two dispensaries, one of them called the Golden Nug. And you find yourself, the Hells Angels basically come and pay you a visit. Walk us through like that confrontation and how you handled that, what was going on there.
I mean, this is just the reality, right? 2010, 2011, the marijuana supply chain in the state of California and the country, at large, and North America for that matter, was criminal. There were these beginnings of programs, not even programs. There were these initial sets of regulations, right? When states were, starting to demonstrate an intention towards creating legal access. But, it was nothing more than like a stake in the ground saying, patients should be protected. But it was left at
Yeah.
that. And so, yes, it might sound like a lot that, the first couple of things you're talking about is a Crips, bodyguard, and now you're talking about Hell's Angels and these, these groups, these notorious groups. But, to me at that time, this character in that world, that was the supply chain. Those were the names of the organizations. And that's the only way it could have been because there weren't licenses for these businesses. There was no legitimacy. There was no tax code. They were criminal. And so who wins in the world business when it's criminal is the organizations that that people know about. That's why they know about them. So yes, these are the groups that I keep encountering at this stage. And we're opening the store in Garden Grove. And as we're opening the store, working on building it out, getting ready for the grand opening, I show up one day in the parking lot, and there was like a manager's office storage area unit. This was a huge car lot, it used to be. So there was the main floor, there was a huge parking lot, and there was like the manager's office, used car office or something in the parking lot. And that had been turned into a dispensary basically overnight. And they put a big
Mhm.
sign out front promoting that they were selling their weed cheaper. Back then, signs used to say 40 cap, 35 cap, 50 cap, whatever the cap was for an eighth of weed. And I think we were a 40 cap. So they put a sign out front that said 35 cap. So we had spent all this time, Andrew spent all this, energy designing this incredible store. And I show up for work as we're getting ready to open, and there's a competitor in my parking lot just advertising with a with uh like a
Sandwich board?
yeah, sandwich board that they're selling cheaper weed than us. So, this is the story you're referencing, yes.
Yeah.
Um, So I eventually walk over to the door and knock on the door, and I'm invited in, and I'm met by an individual, and he's part of the Hells Angels, and he makes it very clear to me that that's that's their business, and explained to me that if I made any trouble for them, that they would have their own way of dealing with it. Um, did his best to rattle me. And, I left there and was very happy to breathe the air outside upon my, opening of that door. But, that character playing that part, committed the way that I was committed at that time, it was par for the course. It wasn't like I didn't get out of there and then, take a call from Laura to talk about, going to dinner with her mom that night, right? This was the world. But what a crazy world it was.
What was the
Yeah, so
through? It sounds like your through line in dealing with all these characters, like Hell's Angels, and your organized crime syndicate for cannabis, was like really just being transparent. Like not like being uber transparent. Like I kind of got that through the book. That was the look here, I'm trying to do being very transparent about what you're trying to do. You don't want to, you don't want to get in the way of what they're trying to do and trying to find a way to work it out. I guess that's the way anyone would do it, but well, that's not the way anyone would do it, but that seemed to be the logical way to do it. Is that kind of correct? Do I have that?
I think that's an awesome observation, man. Um, Helping me even reflect more on myself. Yes. Um, and that is a through line, right? That is a through line to the book and to my life. Um, and it's also, you talked about my public caricature, but like also me as an individual, like my real character. Um, this concept of over transparency. You
Yeah.
mentioned it at the beginning. Hey, when I first met you, it was like you didn't have time for any of the bullshit, or you didn't have time for small talk, and I think you used a Sean Gold term, something about social lubrication, and that I didn't have time for it. Um, I think that's a great observation, but that's all connected, right? Uber transparency, efficient use of the time in the conversation, you know, ignoring the niceties or, the distracting thoughts and ideas, utter focus on the objective of the interaction, you know, it's all connected. And
Yeah.
so there are times where it has served me extremely well, and there are times where it's definitely cost me.
Yeah. I remember
But
talking to
yeah,
you about I remember early on, like asking you, like, have you watched, I was making small talk. Did you watch a TV show or listen to a podcast or something? And you were like, I don't do that. I only l read about cannabis. Like you were like, in any free time I have, I am learning about cannabis or reading about laws or doing like there was no, there was no extra anything for you. I thought that was one, an exceptional amount, kind of focus and really interesting. Um, so I want to move on a little bit to 2014, where cannabis is sort of getting a bit more legit. Um, I guess you have a bigger idea, and you are now raising money. You're trying to raise, what is it, $3.5 million dollars?
from Naresh
So,
Nagpal,
yes, this is
yes, $3.75 million,
yeah. So,
2014.
so play out. So talk about like what you're pitching. Um, and then the scene and what transpires, how you're trying to make this leap, and you meet this guy at the Trump Tower, and how you set up the scene to impress that guy. But first, like, tell us, like, what you want from him, what the pitch is to him, and then how you set the scene.
So there was an evolution from dealing with the supply chain inside of these, medical marijuana dispensaries in a illicit gray market in 2010 to 2014, where, I find myself as a consultant, and, I have this idea of building a management company. By 2014, what had proved itself out was that these states, and it was beginning with the state of Massachusetts, these states would create these merit-based oligopolies as their licensing regimes for this new industry. And by doing that, by that being what transpired, what it created was an opportunity for people inside of these states that were legalizing medical marijuana who were successful business and politically successful people to apply for and receive these licenses. Nobody could apply for and receive these licenses who was a criminal or had any experience operating a business that these people were applying for. They were applying for it based on their good standing. But by making it merit based, meaning that there was an application, it wasn't just a fee. The state asked these applicants to prove out how they were going to operate these businesses. And so my idea was to create this company that could solve for that gap, which would be we understand that the locals are going to get these licenses or local power players, but they're going to need an operating partner with experience. And so we created that concept and went out and started signing clients up, starting with Massachusetts, all the way through Nevada and Illinois. There's a lot of talk about the book in Vegas, and that was all part of that same effort. And that would then lead to what was next. But at the time, that's what we were trying to pursue. And to do it, I needed capital. And I had never raised money before. Everything we did was self-funded. That meant, hustling,
Yeah.
starting with zero to build something from nothing. But this management company opportunity around the country needed to be built, with some real infrastructure like a real business, which means it needed a bankroll to start with. So I had this idea that as opposed to individual applicants perhaps just applying for their own license in their home state, they could invest the money they had allocated into us, and we would be signing these management contracts to be partners with many operators in many states. And so that was the idea. And the scene you're talking about was at the Trump uh, hotel at Central Park. And it was, a move just like inspired by all of my previous experience.
So describe this scene and what you're trying to accomplish. You give a lot of analogies to playing poker, and now you're meeting a guy in the Trump Tower trying to raise $3.5 million. Explain the poker analogy and how it plays out in this scene.
Yeah, it's great. So this is in poker, this is a semi bluff, right? And this is something that also is a theme throughout this book and also, throughout this part of my life, building my life. Um, and the concept of a semi bluff is, making a bet when you are not sure or that currently you do not have the best hand, but that there's the possibility that something will happen next, which will actually make you the best hand. So even if you get called in that bet and you see the next card, there's a chance in that next card that you will have the best hand. While also making that bet, you give yourself a chance for your opponent to fold. And even though you have the worst hand, you didn't have to see that next card. That's a semi bluff.
Hmm.
So important in poker and so important in business. And when you have the kind of conviction that I have, just in the things that I get into, and you have the kind of conviction I have when it comes to cannabis, I semi bluffing everywhere because when it comes to business, the part about the hand needing to improve for me at this point in my journey was never in question. Of course, marijuana was going to become legal. Of course, more states were going to open up access. Of course, as it became accessible, a higher percentage of adults in the United States will consume it. Of course, people will replace alcohol with marijuana. To me, the semi-pluff part of this journey was always, but of course, all these things that have to change in order for this bet to pay off, right? They have to happen. To me, it wasn't a question as to whether they would happen. And in some moments, that was blinding. And in some moments, that gave me vision that allowed me to sprint through open fields, right? And you can even say that in, my final moments as the CEO of MedMen, that kind of outlook buried me.
Well, explain
Uh,
just tactically the
mhm.
cards you're playing out for the scene at the Trump Tower.
Yeah. So at the Trump Tower, we have this great idea, which was a management company. We had a few contracts signed. So validation for this idea. And I had so much conviction that although at that time, maybe only two states had, created these merit-based oligopolies, that every subsequent state would have to follow suit, right? And so those weren't facts. Those were my convictions and beliefs. right? That more states would license people with no experience, and those people would find it in themselves to sign up and pay us to be their operating partner. So I just believed in that so much, but that's a bluff because a lot of those things could have gone wrong. A lot of those things could have not happened. But that was my bet. So the dynamic here is that I need money to accomplish it, yet we're broke. We can't make our bills, we can't pay our bills. And at this point in time, back to poker, I could no longer sneak away to Commerce Casino and make payroll, right? It was too big for that. And so because we found ourselves in that spot, we needed to raise money and we were on fumes. We had the momentum and we had people working and we had things that we were delivering and we had clients we were servicing, but we weren't going to be able to make payroll.
Hmm.
And so, acting real in that moment would have been, me taking a Greyhound bus and meeting this prospective buyer at a Denny's and ordering water with ice and begging him to save our existence. But I understand in the business world, if you do that, I wouldn't get the meeting, and nobody's giving you money because nobody's giving money to something that's dying. So, in order to pull this semi bluff off, right, I had to project success and I had to project that this was inevitable, regardless of this investor's, decision. So I took the last money I had on a credit card. We got this suite at the Trump Hotel. I bought the cheapest ticket I could on Southwest to get all the way over to New York. I made up a story about why I was there to this investor. Um, and when he showed up, the suite that we had rented had this conference table, and I made it look like, we had I was there for other meetings and that there was plates and stuff left behind. Um,
Yeah,
and
like
yeah.
what was really amazing. I mean, in the book, you say you went in the hallway and grabbed other people's room service and brought it into your suite, so it looked like you had a day of meetings.
It's a semi bluff. I mean, I should have been there for a day of meetings because marijuana was so important that it should have been the thing people were meeting about, and it soon would be the thing they were meeting about, and we would soon need that suite. But in the meantime, I knew we would have to be there eventually. I just happen to find myself there right now, kind of,
Right.
doing a little role play of what the future would look like. Okay, so I did. I set up like people were drinking coffee all day and hanging out in there, and put on this performance where it's like a semi bluff. If your opponent believes that you're weak in that moment, it can crush you. They have to believe that there's a high probability that you're not full of shit.
And
And so yeah.
how did that hand play out?
um in the moment, outstanding because I got the yes, and
Hmm.
that investor committed the first investment of its kind in history, in the country, right? Investing into this new concept, this marijuana management company to the tune of $3.75 million. So it ended up amazing, and we were able to make our payroll and live another day and see this hand out. And then we find, just a couple chapters later in the book, that as the hand plays out and our hand strengthens, that investor gets overly zealous and greedy. And, it's my first investor, and it's my first big lesson in how that world, can operate. And it's my first investor back.
So let's move ahead. That's really fascinating because you also, I mean, you closed that deal and you got momentum, built a little bit of hubris. You had a win and you move forward. 4 years later, you're on the eve of your IPO. Another seminal moment in the book. Um, you're 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 smoking now. You're sm In the book, you're smoking some Durban poison, which is one of my favorite strains. Your wife and kids are asleep in the next room, and you're about to go public with a 1.65 billion valuation. Um, and then basically the shit hits the fan. Yeah, I mean, not entirely I mean, none of it's probably your fault, but the economy in Italy crashes and the Dow drops 500 points, and then there's sort of a organized attack against you because you wouldn't go along with some, I guess, extortionists in the cannabis stock pumping business. Tell us, like, take us through that 24 hours.
First of all, I'm glad that you love this book, Sean, and that you find it entertaining. But what you're honing in on now is like just a great moment of like, this is why I wrote the book. Because these are rooms, these are moments, these are stories where there's so much to learn. There's so much. It doesn't matter who you are, what your perspective is, how you're looking at this story. There's so much to gather from these stories of what really happens behind the curtain, right? With the setup you just mentioned, right? In New York City, $1.65 billion valuation, going to be on the stock exchange doing media, on the New York Stock Exchange floor doing media in the morning, mad money in the afternoon. Like you might hear that, but you don't hear the real story. You don't hear what else is happening. As you get higher and higher up the mountain, the air gets thinner and thinner, and way more slips and falls, right? But nobody's sharing them. I don't know, shame, embarrassment, like, but this
Yeah.
is real. So yes, on one hand, on top of the world, right? Starting off with absolutely nothing, making a commitment to make cannabis successful in some way for me financially so that I could build a life for me and Laura. And now sitting there, not only because weed and has created financial stability for me and my now wife, but sitting there because weed has become my mission in my life, and the world was paying attention, and the culture in our society was shifting. And in some small way, I was having an impact on that, right? I was having my influence on that. In again, like nothing to think about with the thing that I was had most conviction in my life about, just mainstreaming of marijuana. So on one hand, at the top of the world. On the other hand, that top of that mountain, man, is it thin? Man, is it fickle? Man, is it slippery? Like every direction you look. And so, I detail, one of those attacks, one of those moments of getting pushed and slipping and, figuring out how to try to hold on up there, where there was a concerted effort by these marketers in Canada to destroy or tank the value of our stock on opening day. And yes, there were these world events, and so that helped give them their opening. But there was a slew of other stuff. Like we were listing, Sean, on the junior stock exchange in a foreign country because the business that we were operating was federally illegal in the
Right.
country where we were operating. So, when you think about, yes, then there were these vicious attacks, and then maybe even how does it feel to be, it's like, well, I always, because I was there in the room, I understood the reality. Like I understood why I was in the room, at Garden Grove with the Hells Angels. I knew why I was there. I had made a commitment to be involved in this world, and that was part of that world. I'm going public on the Canadian Securities Exchange, where our $1.65 billion value is higher than the total combined value of every other company on the exchange together. Okay. And to do that, we had to make so many deals with so many investment bankers and so many people that didn't even live in the United States that worked in a whole different world. Regulations in the OSC, the Ontario Securities Exchange, versus the SEC. It's like going to the SEC before 1930 or something. It's just a different world. We might call it more the Wild West. Of
Hmm.
course, I knew the deals I had to make, the commitments that we made along the way, and how we got to be where you're talking about, the top of that mountain, right? And so it was not as much of a gut punch as it was, it's not like it was surprising to that character that then we were under attack because I wouldn't pay a couple $1 million to somebody that wanted me to pay them to write nice things about us and to prove a point to the rest of the industry that would be coming, would prove to everybody that if you didn't pay them, that this is what they could do to you. Like, oh, I get it. Like, those are the characters that are in that world. I wish we could have been on the NASDAQ. I was fighting so that marijuana could be on the NASDAQ, so that this nonsense wasn't happening to what we call institutional marijuana, so that those businesses, and at that time I thought MedMen and myself would be a part of that future, but so that those businesses, devoid of dealing with this nonsense, could truly focus on changing the world through weed.
So, and I think I mean, the book reads like, to me, it reads like The Wolf of Wall Street, or I've read the book about real estate market, The Big Short. And what's for a lay person, the book's really interesting because there's a lot of tactical stuff. I mean, you're talking macro and why you did things in this conversation, but the just my, you have a guy, the Wolf of Wall Street or Weed Street, who is trying to get you to do stock manipulation. You choose not to. He goes after you, and meanwhile, the road, the the road is littered with a lot of people who've gone to jail for actually colluding with this guy and people like this. Um, you decide not to. What happens when they go after you? The market, what happens on day one when you do go public? Well, what happens to your stock?
It gets crushed. I don't know, double digit down by the end of the day. Um, that whole day is accounted for in the book, the best that I could recall it, with a lot of help. And I end the day on a curb in a dirty New York City street, and my family's inside having dinner, and I'm outside with my shrink on the telephone. Um, you know,
Hmm.
just lost. Um,
Are you taking like Xanax or Ambien or any stuff like that to get through these experiences?
Never,
Okay,
never.
just
Only
curious.
weed.
Thought I'd
Only
ask.
weed. Yeah, only weed, man. So what a day, right? Waking up the way that you said it, going through just another street fight, just like all the rest of them, except this time it was through the internet, and this time it was with millions of dollars, being talked about, and this time it had an impact, a ripple based on the stock price of hundreds of millions of dollars. But it was a street fight nonetheless, right? And so the day we went public, the street fights just, went to a different arena. But that hand to hand, that it I, I appreciated back in the days of the Hells Angels now, because at least I
Yeah.
knew what I was walking into. It's like I say in the book, like at least with poker, I know when all the cards are done, like, I know this beats this. It's very straight. Doesn't matter how we got there. The more I get into this corporate world, the more I get into the institutional world of, stocks and Bay Street and Wall Street, the more that just evades me. And it's harder, it's understanding everybody's, a shark. And there were a lot of sharks in this story.
Yeah.
But they're not playing it
Yeah.
honestly and transparently the way
The
that the
story
gangsters used to.
story is shark after shark. That's what's really fascinating. It just propels you forward into a different, every shark situation, sharks weaved in with sharks, sharks coming back into the story after you thought they were gone. It's really it's really like a fascinating read. I introduced you to a friend, and when I read it, immediately introduced you to a friend of mine who makes films. I was like, this has to be made into a film. I do not introduce many people to her, and every person I have introduced has she's made, which is three, including you, but the first two she actually made films. Um, so let's cross your fingers, uh, if that's what you want. So let's go to sort of the peak and the fall and the reflection of MedMen. There's a scene we call the Aspen Massacre in the book. You're on vacation with your kids. You learn you have you're constantly raising money. even though you're a public company, you're expanding. It's very much like internet 1999, where it's just get big first, own the space, expand. That was the mentality. Um, so you're in another, I mean, you're basically in the same situation you were, in the Trump Tower, but just much bigger stakes. So explain the situation where you're raising money, you're at the ski resort. Share that story, like what, how you get through that, what's happening with that situation.
Whoa, a lot happening.
I think it was 20
A
going up,
lot.
right?
So what's happening is that I entered into a agreement with Gotham Green for $250 million to be invested into MedMen.
Right.
Um, and that agreement would put hooks into the business that the business never had a chance of, wriggling off of. And so maybe 6 months into that agreement being in effect, those hooks are, being used to reel MedMen me in. And I am fighting again, like the whole book, right? I'm in street fights. And now I'm fighting with Gotham Green and their face and head of that named Jason Adler. And so as he tries to reel us in, um, one of my last real big stand uh, was to convince investors to come invest into MedMen on the equity side. Means they couldn't give us a loan because he had the right to block that, and he
Hmm.
wouldn't allow it because he was trying to make sure that we ran out of money so that
Right.
he could take it over. Um, and the only way that we were allowed to bring any money in to do something as simple as make payroll, if that's what it came to, was with an equity investment, somebody buying a percentage of the company. Well, there were a lot of things happening, including this Gotham Green deal, but a mega merger that we had entered into a year earlier
Hmm.
with a company called PharmaCann, right, the largest merger at the time in the history of marijuana, largest acquisition, um,
And PharmaCann had a
had
bunch of cash, right? So that would have solved your Gotham Green problem.
uh, maybe not, right? It's one of these things that I think there's a lot of inevitabilities to this story, regardless of how some of these details may have worked out.
Hmm.
But compounding the hooks in us, we had a mega deal that was killed, not because of anything we did or PharmaCann did, or any lack of excitement in the public markets to support it. It was all the opposite. Everybody was enthusiastic, and the Department of Justice ultimately
Yeah,
unraveled that deal.
I want to
So,
talk about more specifically the Department of Justice
yeah.
and that story. But let's kind of talk about this. So what happens when you're in Aspen and you have this $25 million deal on the table?
So, despite all of that, we're able to um, get an investor excited, an investment group excited about investing into MedMen, despite everything I just said, and the deals that fell apart, and the loan that had the hooks into us. In my mind, with the restructuring that we were doing around the business after that deal fell apart, this investment group would give us the money we needed to get through what I looked at as our restructuring. How do we restructure the business for the reality of this horrible loan on top of us and this mega merger, killed? And so we came to terms with these investors, and it was like a showdown at the OK Corral with Jason Adler and Gotham Green. There's a story in the book at the Four Seasons Bar in Vegas, when we announced this deal. And I go on vacation with my family. A lot of this is happening. I guess, instead of never taking a vacation once every year, I should never take one every 10 years. Um, I went from Mexico and now we're in the snow. But I've got two kids, and um, over December break, we took them to the snow. And while my kids are in the snow, and I believe that we had solved this issue, I get word that the lead investor died. At that time, it was that he was in critical care. We learned later he passed away, but the lead investor in this deal died literally, or went into his coma, literally the day that the funding was supposed to have taken place. And so that investment unravels. Gotham Green now back has their hooks and we're almost fully out of the water. And
Mm.
at this point, my biggest investor, Wicklow Capital, my equity partner, the people that were my supporters for, some period of time, they turn on me too. And so now I'm in the snow. I'm supposed to be, present with my family. And I went from what I thought was, solving an issue and having a path forward to, just the craziest of all, not almost unbelievable things happening to this investor. And that opening the door for the dominoes for my biggest investor to turn on me. And that was really, the beginning. That was the end of the end.
Yeah.
They end up getting me to sign a personal guarantee on on shares that they had and were buying in the company, meaning, hey, Adam, the only way that we're going to help or we're going to put money in as we've committed, and this is in the book too, is if you sign a personal guarantee. So if in the next year we can't sell our stock and get it back for what it's worth, I'm going to take it out of you. It's like, well, I'm not getting any of the money. It's not going in my pocket. You're putting the money into the company. It's running payroll. Like, I, no, you're signing this or we won't fund the company. Um, and
Do
so
you
that
sign?
was really the end. Yeah, that was when they had the final piece hanging over me. I don't account for it in the book at all, but they ended up squeezing that piece after they got me to sign it. Really
Okay.
nasty stuff.
So is that
Leaning. Yeah,
so there's a
it's
scene
not
in the
legal,
book?
I don't think.
There's a scene in the book when you're at your son's soccer game and you learn Jason Adler, who's pitched himself as your white knight investor, is shopping around CEO candidates to replace you. Is that after this you signed this deal or what?
No, that was before.
That was
No, I
before.
mean he made his intentions clear much earlier than this, right before the PharmaCann deal broke. It was crystal clear as to where he was and what his intentions were. And that group and Jason Adler, it wasn't like just MedMen. They were doing this was their program, right? And so we saw how they were dealing with other companies in the industry, and there's a lot of very public stuff about their
Mhm.
interaction with Ianthus. And so like we understood what it was. Um,
Yeah.
so no, that soccer game when I got the call where he really said, "This is who I am," when I was watching Mateo play soccer, no, that was before.
And this really upset your wife because she was friends with his wife, right? You're like,
Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that like I wish I could have read about when I was 20 something and I just was voracious about, any story I could get my hands on that would help, inform me, give me tools or understanding as I went through my journey, right? Like, yeah, my wife went crazy because we were so naive, both of us, right? Nobody
Mhm.
ever told us this story. Nobody ever told us that someone would make such an effort with us on a personal level and be so fake because they only had a transactional intention from the outset. We were too naive to that. We're just, this person represents themselves as a certain way. They must be that. If that's a friend, then that's a friend. Wait, a friend doesn't act this way. Wait a second, there is no such thing as a friend in this person's world. The way this person's world works, and now, it's easier for me to see it, right? A transactional world, someone like that, a group like that, they're exclusively living in a transactional world. They always saw me, the company, as a transaction, nothing more, nothing less. So makes sense. Um, but we were too naive to understand it. And it really, on an emotional level, destroyed Laura. Yeah. I mean, it was, and I can understand, the wife made a big effort with my wife as a way of getting in with us. Um,
Yeah, crazy.
yeah.
So, I mean, not so crazy, but it's in the story, I mean, in the book, it really is, it's really, kind of amazing how things turn around on you. The so let's talk about the uh, Bill Barr, right? He's the Attorney General of the United States at the time. He like retro. I mean, when I knew the PharmaCann deal and that was supposed to go through, when I read the book and the Department of Justice's involvement in delaying that deal, it really kind of reframed the whole thing. I didn't know why that deal was not going through. It appeared to me after reading the book that it could have changed the whole outcome future for MedMen had it gone through. Um, for people, watching now, share like what, how the U.S. government, Bill Barr specifically, was targeting you, delaying your deal, and really changing really the outcome for MedMen in general.
Well, I only have hindsight now. So, I mean,
Of
from
course.
today's perspective, right? Because while I was going through the PharmaCann deal, I had no idea. It wasn't until later that I understood and learned what was going on and had happened,
How
right?
did
So
you
with
learn?
that, I saw a piece about a whistleblower and the Attorney General of the United States, and I looked further into the piece, and because it had to do with cannabis, as it wasn't the main part of it, but they got into cannabis, and then found the word MedMen somewhere, and you know just assume that there would be, a whole story uncovered. Because what's more interesting and salacious than that? I assume there'd be a media frenzy around the fact that there was a whistleblower that went to Congress, to testify against the Attorney General of the United States of America. And in their testimony, they mention MedMen by name, and they mention the fact that Bill Barr instructed his underlings to stymie the industry and block mergers, the first of which was ours. Like, isn't that a movie in and of itself? I want to be in those rooms. Whoa. Like, yeah, but that's
You,
all public record now. So,
yeah.
I found out and I haven't learned much more because there hasn't been that coverage. And we can go into, the world of marijuana and its media coverage and the mainstream's coverage of cannabis on a different conversation or this one if you want. But like, fuck, that's the story of the year. I want to know more. I'm sure there's so much I don't know,
Well, there is,
but I
we don't
only know, yeah.
Yeah, there you don't we're getting into it now, but there is, I mean, you do lay it out in the book for people like kind of the different steps where you get blocked. You get blocked here. There's certain points where you're supposed to move forward and you don't. And retrospectively, understanding what the US government was doing, it all becomes crystal clear. It's a really interesting read, that part of it. Um, let's jump to more like just personal experience. Your father figure, your father throughout the book is a really complex character. He teaches you poker and introduces you to business, but then later tries to extort you by, threatening to report you to federal authorities. Like it's really crazy the relationship you have with him. Um, you're living on his couch at one point, and then, you know, so share like the level of betrayal that you felt and how you reconcile those differences with your father. Like to tell you the truth, after reading the book, and you tend to like you as the main character. I know you, that may help, but I still haven't forgiven your father after reading the book, and I'm really interested to hear like how you process that and how what well give some background on what happened and then how you dealt with that internally.
Well, first of all, I mean, the reason that I'm including stuff like that is because I want to tell the whole story of my experience during this time. And to do that, it's about the story of me, right? And that's holistic. It's not just the business, it's what's going on everywhere else. Because in that, even for me, writing the book, right, it helps me understand context, how someone can make a decision like whatever, how someone could walk into that storefront, you know, pop up with the Hells Angels waiting. How could you might have said like, how could you do that? Well, who is that person and what experiences led them to making those decisions and taking those actions? And as you said, my father just played the most vital role in my early development. Um, and
Hmm.
so, I do talk about our relationship in the book, and you're talking about one particular scene in the book where, he's essentially blackmailing me for money, um, and serious blackmail. Um, but again, like if I could write my dad's book and we could start with his family history and we could go through his, mental and psychological diagnoses and his chemical balance or imbalances, and then talk about his entire life and then talk about that moment, there'd be context, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And, I think for me, it's like, hey, in the book, he's extorting his son. I mean, and as a father, if I even allowed myself to think about that, I can't, I don't know what to do with it. But he's not me. And so if I'm going to be real about this, that's something that really happened. And so that informs who I am and, like why in part I'm here today. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to really get into like
yeah.
my relationship with him more than I talked about it in the book, because the book isn't about him or all of his, who he is as a character, but it's more about the reader just, me sharing with them my experience as a way to understand, the trajectory of the book and the stories around it. So yeah, my own father, told me that if I didn't pay him a certain amount of money, that he was going to go to the federal government and rat on me and my friends. Did he need the money for his rent? Was he desperate? Was he being, in a manic or, depressed episode? Was he not on his meds? All those other things aside,
Right.
you say unforgivable. Yeah, for some people that's unforgivable. There's a lot of stuff that my dad has done over our life that's unforgivable to a lot of people, I would think. For me, I try my best to forgive it all, and I try my best to eradicate my own mind of any expectations from him,
Yeah.
and rather look at him as the father and the grandfather that we have. He is my father, good, bad, ugly. He is my father, and this is who he is.
Yeah.
There's
No,
some tragic, crazy
yeah,
shit in this book, man. I mean,
I get it.
yeah, it
I
was,
mean, it
yeah.
sounds like you know, obviously sounds not as bad as Elon Musk's father, slightly better than my father. My father and I were in a business deal, and he double crossed me on the deal. I'm like a young kid, and it just bewildered me. I talk about to my brothers about this, and they just can't even imagine it as a father. They can't even like I as a father would I would lose money. I put my child before me in anything. And it's just bewildering. Maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. It's kind of crazy, but like you, I never put myself after that. I never put myself in a position to be, manipulated by him. And, he was my father. I didn't have another one. So I went forward and made the best of it, keeping him at kind of arm's length. So, let's talk about sort of like, I guess, you and coming, letting go. There's this powerful moment when you're meeting this psychologist, Phil Stutz, now famous from Jonah Hill's documentary. And he tells you the story about an artist, watching one of his masterpieces being painted over. Tell, Describe that scene, tell the story, and how that resonated with you moving on from MedMen.
Yeah, Stutz was, without Stutz, I don't know. It would have been different. I know that. Um, and so, there's this week at MedMen, which I account for in the book, it starts with that classic boardroom scene that has been accounted for in movies before, right? Where the unassuming founder shows up jolly at work one day and they're waiting for him in the board her in the boardroom to take their head off, right? So I had
Right.
that moment, I had that scene, I account for it. And then there's this week between then and when I actually leave, I resign, and give my, resignation speech and leave
Yeah.
really for the last time. Um, and so during that time, there was so much in my mind, I couldn't think straight. You talk about a forest through the trees, like I was down in a deep rabbit hole, couldn't see anything, just dark. Um, and Stutz was the one person that I, could go to that could see it from a bigger place and try to help me navigate through it. And he ends up telling me this story about uh, some, painter or artist, that has some recognition for a masterpiece that they painted inside of a church, and he's later in his life now, and he's working on some art. I think he's 90 or what. Stutz told me this amazing elaborate story. But he's in his last years and he's working on something, and someone comes running in and says, "They're ruining your masterpiece." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "They're painting over whatever it was that you did, and they're ruining it." And he asked the person to leave. He threw them out. And in so doing, let them know that he was working on creation right now. That's what he was working on. And that what that person had run in to talk about was something that he had created in the past. And once he created it, he had given it up and he
Yeah.
had moved on to whatever it was that he was going to create next and next and next. And his was a process of creation. And so Stutz turned it on me and said, "Adam, what are you going to create next?" And he really framed it for me and finalized it to say, you know, you can talk about going back to battle and you can go fight this next, street battle, as you call it, with these guys yet another time. And you might win yet another time. But how much would you pay? Let's just talk about money. How much would you pay today to never not only have to fight, but have to talk to or deal with these people ever again in your life? And that question stunned me. Um, and the answer was everything I have outside of what I need to take care of, the food and shelter and education and the comforts for me and my family. He said, "Then what are you doing? Get the fuck out of there. Figure out how to do it and don't look back. What are you going to create next?" Um, yeah, I don't know what would have happened without that conversation, but that happened. And 2 days later, I left the company.
Yeah. It's pretty powerful. I'm listening to you tell this story now, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to create next. I'm gonna ask you a couple quick questions. Really appreciate you spending time today. Um, what would you say is the worst business advice you've ever received?
Hmm. Worst business advice as an entrepreneur?
I mean, there's I could just suggest about 20 from the book.
The worst business advice I ever received as an entrepreneur was that, something couldn't or shouldn't be done, because it wasn't baked enough. I think that is the worst, business outlook for an entrepreneur. And that's the worst advice that continually I see, hear, and experience being doled out. Hey, that's a really great idea. Now fill out this part of your plan. Okay, now once this part of your plan is filled out, now how are you going to look at this aspect of your business? It's like, wait a second. It's an idea in your head. So until that idea manifests itself as something that's real and happening, you can't do those other things. It's an academic, intellectual exercise at best. How do you figure out how to get into business so you can actually figure out what you have, right? And there's just so many people stuck and so many people giving the advice to stay stuck. Oh, that's a really great idea to open the XYZ business. Really great idea. But did you see those other people in that other town over? They have the same kind of business. I don't know. Maybe look at something else because competition's not great. Or I know you don't have all the money you need yet to really do it how you want to do it. So how many more years of saving until you give it a go? Like, you have an idea, but then the flip side is, I think the hardest thing as an entrepreneur, and I think the rarest thing in business, period, is to manifest an idea into an actual business.
So the worst, so to summarize, the worst business advice you've ever received is just don't do it.
And my advice is, as you know from the book, and this also comes from my dad, why not?
Why not? What what is the best leadership book you've ever read?
American Icon. It's a book about this executive from Boeing who goes to become the CEO of Ford. And, among many other things that he's staring into is that the CEO of Ford is traditionally a Ford. And they brought him in as the operator because Ford was staring into insolvency.
Mhm.
And he came in and he applied a clinical approach to looking at their day-to-day business as a way to get them through a restructuring during, the worst time in US automotive recent history and out the other side healthy. And he didn't do it because he was a car guy. And he didn't do it because he had magic. And he didn't do it because, he happened to have $1 trillion. He did it because he was clinical. And he was so, what I loved most about it was he identified, for me, he identified what success was before embarking upon any particular project, all the way down to singular meetings, right? He wouldn't have meetings unless the meeting was first defined by the person calling the meeting, defined by what success would be, how that played into their greater plan,
Mhm.
and allowing everybody to, familiarize themselves. And I know this is something that a lot is talked about with a lot of leaders doing, but the way in which he did it for me, really helped transform how I thought about being efficient as an entrepreneur, as an operator, as a CEO. And it has definitely informed, how I've gone about my business thereafter. But I remember, I think the greatest takeaway from that book was he would have weekly standing meetings with different groups on different projects. And the common thread throughout the meetings was prior to the meeting, when the memo was circulated, the issues, the things out of budget, over time, problematic were highlighted. And then the meeting would begin, and the meeting they would only talk about the issues. Because what is the need to talk about the 45 things that are on track, the 5 things that are ahead of schedule? If nothing more than to do what? Have somebody feel like they got to read a piece of, like, that blew my mind. You're right. Why are we sitting here talking about the fact that, we said we were going to do 100 grand of sales in the store last week and we did it. Like, let's talk about the fact that our margin went down 2%. That was the big red circle. That's all we're going to talk about this week. And I have the time because I'm not going to waste my time, Sean Gold, inefficiently or social lubrication with all the other stuff because it's going well. And God, the way he explained it, man, it's a great book.
What's the name of the book one more time?
American Icon.
American Icon. And what is the name of your book and when does it come out?
Weed Empire, April 22nd. I
April.
just finished recording the audiobook last week. And that was a pretty cool experience.
Interesting. How long do you
Yeah.
think that's going to be?
Oh, they'll come out at the same time.
No, how long is the audio book? How many hours? Do you have any
Oh,
idea?
I don't
You
know.
have to edit it.
Your 300-page book, Sean, it started off as like 900 pages when it first it was all the stories, the full chronology, putting it all down. The first run around almost 900 pages. And now you read 300 pages of it.
Right.
Um, and so there's 600 other pages that are out there that I'm uh, excited to talk about and that I will be talking about.
Hmm.
And so I think 2025 is going to be a year of, me doing the best I can to share this information in the hopes that, people can grab onto some part of it in some way that can help, inform their better tomorrow.
Well, I really, really appreciate you sharing the story. Like I said, the book is really fascinating. It's a not only is it really a history of legal weed, uh, but it's just an unbelievable journey through the
Oh,
process of legitimacy.
it was a very full experience. I am so grateful that I got to experience and go through all of it. And I'm here on the other side talking to you. And hopefully all of us, using whatever we went through yesterday to inform how to just do it a little bit better tomorrow.